If we look at the strategic picture between Beijing, Washington, and Taipei, let's look at Washington's perspective first. What Washington wants, essentially, is to use Taipei as a tool against Beijing. This is something that a lot of people forget, but this is the underlying thread in all U.S. policy. Of course, it works the same for the other parties too. Taipei is using Washington against Beijing, and Beijing is using Washington against Taipei, and you know, it gets very complicated. But I think there's something that that I want to focus in on, and that's the difference between the rhetoric and the reality. The rhetoric says that Washington is concerned about freedom and democracy, human rights. But that's not really its highest priority. The highest priority is the interests of the American nation, or the interests of the ruling party. Anyone who gets his information about Taiwan, about Sino-US relations, from the international media will get the impression that what the U.S. is concerned about, and what foreign journalists, and specifically American journalists, are concerned about, is human rights, democracy, freedom, human rights, democracy, and freedom. But this is not, unfortunately, their true priority. What the U.S. really wants is to use Taiwan to control China. In Chinese, this is known as 以台制华, and this has been a constant in U.S. policy for 30, 40 years. If you were a U.S. leader, the way you would use Taiwan, you would not want Taiwan to reunify with mainland China anytime soon. What you would want to do is you would want to keep it separate and keep it on a leash, and yank on that leash whenever it was convenient for you, to make trouble for Beijing, or else to give them the impression that you were helping by jerking on the Taiwan independence faction's leash. So it would be something that was useful for you long term. So you would never want them to be reunified. That's an interesting point, because recently the U.S. stated that they didn't care specifically which weapons were bought. They just wanted the $18 billion. They wanted Taiwan to sign off on the $18 billion total sum. And that the content of the purchase, the deal, could be renegotiated at any time. So, I mean, that shows you they just want the money. Well, you know, the U.S. is in financial straits now. The war on terror is costing them a lot of money. I mean, the war in Afghanistan and Iraq, and now maybe Iran, it's running up an enormous debt, and they've got to get some money coming in. It's significant. I mean, yeah. I mean, it's. I don't have the figures right on. I don't have the figures right now off the top of my head. Let's look at the positions. You said the PFP, the KMT, the PFP, and the DPP, right? The DPP wants the weapons purchase, or I should say, Chen Shui-bian wants the weapons purchase to buy off the U.S. This is the belief of many opposition party leaders. Many opposition leaders are convinced that the weapons purchase is what's known as 封口费. It's something that Chen Shui-bian negotiated with the U.S. government, with the Bush administration, in exchange for its silence, because the belief is that the U.S.'s intelligence capabilities, the NSA, for example, has all the electronic communications that took place during the 319 shooting, and they know that it was faked and it was staged. And in exchange for remaining silent, the Chen administration is buying the U.S.'s silence with the $18 billion.
When you say electronic
surveillance,
could you be more specific about how they know?
This includes, see, the U.S. has incredible electronic intelligence gathering capabilities. They can intercept all kinds of signals, cell phones, cell phone communications, ordinary plain old telephone, satellite, internet to email. They intercept it all. This is I personally believe they do. A lot of people share this belief. Yeah, I think that they were talking turkey. They're talking terms. I mean, how much for what? Tit for tat, quid pro quo. No, they definitely have a preference. That the U.S. definitely prefers the Green camp in power. The U.S. long-term U.S. policy has been to use the Greens against the Blues and the Reds. In other words, let me put it this way. It's essentially divide and conquer. The U.S. government's priority is global hegemony. They don't make any bones about it. Neoconservative think tanks have come out and said so openly. They don't even bother to hide it. People, at the Weekly Standard, for example, they use the term benevolent global hegemony. Whether it's benevolent or not, you can make up your own mind about. But global hegemony, yes. And how do you attain global hegemony? You keep every other nation on the planet weak. And Taiwan, whether Taiwan is democratic or not, is not the U.S.'s primary consideration. The U.S. is not helping to defend Taiwan because Taiwan is democratic. Taiwan is not democratic. The U.S. is helping to defend Taiwan because they want to weaken China by keeping it divided. The Taiwan independence movement is a thorn in China's side. There's a notion we have to disabuse ourselves of, and that's that the U.S. government cares about freedom and democracy on Taiwan. It doesn't. What the U.S. cares about is using Taiwan as a tool. The U.S. cares about using the Taiwan independence movement as a tool against China, against a resurgent China. The Taiwan independence movement is a thorn in China's side. This is the reason the U.S. Actually prefers to have a pan-green president like Lee Tung-hui or Chen Shui-bian in power. They want to use Taiwan independence against mainland China and the pan-blue pro-reunification faction on Taiwan. The U.S. is not only using the Taiwan independence movement against the 1.3 billion Chinese on the mainland. The U.S. is also using the Taiwan independence movement, the minority of Taiwan independence supporters on Taiwan, against the democratic majority of pro-reunificationists on Taiwan. You can see this is why the U.S. really has no interest in freedom and democracy on Taiwan. And this is why when push came to shove, the U.S. sided with the Chen administration in the 2004 election and refused to overturn what they knew to be a fraudulent election. Look at the difference between what happened. People, the pan-blue, everyone on Taiwan, including the pan-blue pundits, have been talking about the election in the Ukraine. Now, why was the election in the Ukraine overturned? And why could the orange faction in the Ukraine overturn the election? And why did the orange faction in the Ukraine receive U.S. assistance? Why was the pan-blue faction unable to overturn what was clearly an equally fraudulent election on Taiwan? Why did the U.S. not side with the pan-blues on Taiwan? The answer is very simple. The orange faction in the Ukraine was an anti-Soviet, anti-Russian faction, whereas the pan-blue faction on Taiwan was a pro-China faction, pro-reunification faction. The thread remains constant. The U.S. wants to divide and conquer. Whoever cooperates with the U.S. in dividing and conquering a foreign nation receives U.S. assistance. Whoever who fails to cooperate with the U.S. in dividing and conquering a foreign nation doesn't get U.S. assistance. It has nothing to do with freedom and democracy. This is exactly right. Why didn't Colin Powell, after the March 20th election, which was totally unacceptable, why didn't he come out and say that Chen Shui-bian's fraudulent shooting and election ballot theft was unacceptable? Why did he only say that for the Ukraine? See, there's a double standard here. And the double standard is not based on whether the election was democratic and free and fair. The double standard is based on which faction supports the overall U.S. strategy of dividing and conquering other nations. Why did the U.S. object to the results of the Ukrainian election? Because as far as the U.S. was concerned, the wrong party won. What was the wrong party? The wrong party was the party that favored Russia. Why did the U.S. not object to the results of the election on Taiwan? Because the right party won. The party that was making trouble for China. That's why Colin Powell spoke out against the Ukrainian election and didn't speak out against the Taiwan election, even though both elections were fraudulent. So the real issue wasn't freedom and democracy. The real issue wasn't fair elections, free and fair elections. The real issue was who won. Did the party that favored U.S. strategic dominance win? That was the issue. It's always been the issue.